bring up one additional issue that Gail and I talked about so much during the exhibition, and that is the role, and was part of the premise for this first series of talks, especially Joanna's, and that is the role of terracotta and ornament and the designer and the execution, and another aspect of 19th century architectural theory, which is, I know Gail and I have talked about the kind of Ruskinian philosophy that underlies the idea of like joy in work and the handmade product. And of course we talked about this with Susan Tunick, who helped us on all the terracotta in the exhibition. So one of the things that Gail and I were talking about when we did the show and trying to kind of nail the themes that we wanted to communicate, because terracotta is at least a third of the show, the role of ornament is at least a third of the show, is who designed that? Yeah. Who designed that? It's not Cass Gilbert who designed it, and we talked about it for a very long time, and whether Ruskinian underpinnings for a medieval guild kind of philosophy of joy in work, or a sense of play or invention in ornament that's so much a part of the appreciation of the Gothic, as it goes back to a medieval precedent of some utopian medieval age, or whether it's just a means of manufacturing things quickly in the 86 days in which those drawings need to be produced, and then the mass production of terracotta by punching it into the molds and making 30 of those. The lobby is much more of an artistic expression, I think, than the multiplication of the units of 400,000 units of terracotta on the facade. But those same questions, we can talk about philosophy and we can talk about execution and materiality, but how many different ways can those ideas be sliced and diced? You want to sit down? Okay, all right.
I can speak one point. I mean, the thing that we shouldn't forget is that these offices were big offices. They had multiple people working there. How many people were in Cass Gilbert's office? Even Sullivan had a relatively large office in the 1890s. So when we use the word Sullivan and Gilbert, we're really not talking about individuals. We're talking about offices that had very rationalized and corporatized ways of working. So the ornament that we credit to those men was not in fact the work of those men as individuals, but as the work of offices. The other thing I want to say is in relation to the Fisher building, which I've worked on a little bit, a lot of the reception of that building was involved with critics saying how wonderful it is that we now have these industrialized methods of reproduction, which mean that we can quickly and easily and very well do what would take 50 or 100 years in the hands of a medieval mason. So by the time the Fisher building was completed, the idea of any kind of value of hand labor was completely rejected, and the verdict was that industrialization was in fact only of positive benefit to the building industry and to the city as a whole.
I'm going to say something briefly and then turn it over to Gail, because she knows this better than almost anybody else. Gilbert's office is different from a lot of the other architectural offices. Kimby White had a huge office, around 100 people. Gilbert deliberately kept his office quite small because he liked this kind of atelier atmosphere. He was able to his employees on travel grants to Europe. But I'm going to turn it over to Gail because I think she has a great story about how they actually did push out all the detailing in the Woolworth Building through the use of other people.
Okay, it's really interesting to look at the series of drawings of the Woolworth Building in the archives at New York Historical Society. And what you do see is, first of all, a close collaboration between Cass Gilbert and Thomas R. Johnson, who was mentioned in Mary Beth's talk. Gilbert called Johnson a designer of rare ability, and he was that. This man was incredibly talented, designer, could produce perspectives. Many of the perspectives of the Woolworth Building, the most beautiful ones, were drawn by Johnson relatively quickly. So we have Thomas R. Johnson, who sadly died in 1950, right after the Woolworth Building was completed, working as Gilbert's right-hand design man, and really designing together in a sense. And I don't mean to make that sound as if Gilbert is not the mastermind. Gilbert certainly is, but he's working with an incredibly talented assistant. And then, in addition to that, as Johnson is refining the design, he begins to work more closely with the people who are supplying the crafted details of the Woolworth Building. So he begins to work more closely with the firm Donnelly and Ritchie, who were actually the modelers for the terracotta, and they actually modeled the copper ornament as well. And Gilbert specified in the specifications for the Woolworth Building that Donnelly and Ritchie would model their models for the terracotta on site at Atlantic Terracotta. So I'm just telling you this to show you that Cass Gilbert's design, and he only has 25 people working for him during this project, is actually extending out of the office and into the manufacturing plant. And Johnson, his right-hand designer, is going over to Atlantic Terracotta, approving those models of Donnelly and Ritchie and saying they're okay. And this is basically kind of the way the whole thing was done, meaning that he also was working very closely with Gunvald Alves, the structural engineer, an immensely talented engineer from Norway who studied in Munich. It was just somebody who understood the state of the art when it came to design of steel structures. Gunvald Alves produced the shop drawings for the production of the steel, the fabrication of the steel, in offices that were on the floor just below Gilbert's office in the Metropolitan Life Insurance Annex. And he brought in 80 or so designers, meaning structural designers, drawing they knew where every rivet was going to go in the steel structure. And so Gilbert's back and forth, Johnson are back and forth, they're looking at the steel, and those are shop drawings, so those are sent straight to the fabricator. And then Atlantic Terracotta, to make things easier, sent a group of draftsmen over to the Metropolitan Life Insurance on another floor. And Johnson's overseeing them produce drawings for the terracotta at shrinkage scale that were then, used as the basis to make the molds. So we have a range of people working on this, and if you add them all up, now Gilbert would say, oh sure, my office is 25 people, but if you add these teams of 50 or 100 coming from Alves' engineering firm and from Atlantic Terracotta, it becomes a really big enterprise. Something that I just learned a few weeks ago that I haven't had a chance to share with anybody is that some new drawings of the Woolworth Building have been discovered in somebody's storage closet in Maine. They've been protected for a long time. What these drawings show is great areas of the facade drawn in great detail. So I imagine these were draftsmen in Gilbert's office working under Gilbert. This was the intermediary stage before they're sent to the phase of shrinkage scale. You're drawing each piece for Atlantic Terracotta. So it was a fascinating process, and I continue today to be amazed at how fast they were able to do all of this. It just astounds me.
I actually have a question that went in a slightly different direction, so I hope you'll indulge me. Which is over here. Yeah, I guess that makes some sense. For listening to people who know much more about Gilbert than I do, I was struck that, and maybe you can resolve what seems to me to be a kind of contradiction, which is on the one hand he seems to say at some points, well, any kind of, detail is fine as long as it's going to work and make sense, or you can do it fast or whatever. And then on the other hand, he does seem to have a particular investment in the Gothic, and he wants to send the drawings to France and so on. So, I don't know, maybe you guys can resolve that for me.
I think Mary Beth should answer this.
Well, he's very interesting because he's very eclectic. I mean, you look at the two skyscrapers that preceded it, Broadway Chambers just up the street here, which is much more a classically Renaissance-inspired building, and Gilbert goes through two different schemes for Broadway Chambers. He has one that is the one we see today, which is the very richly colored red brick and pink granite, and then he has one that's kind of a pale, kind of off-white scheme. He develops both of these pretty far along, and then he kind of at the end is like, oh no, I like the white one better, oh no, wait, I gotta do the red. And when we some of us had the really great privilege of going up to Connecticut, to Waterbury, to Ridgefield. We were looking at the Waterbury Municipal Building, which is also a red brick and stone building. At the last minute, he's like, no, I want it all stone. The red is like too. So he goes through a lot of different permutations himself. And I think interesting, given Gail's remarks about Bragdon, he writes, I think it may be to Cram, I can't remember precisely who, and he says, well, I used to be more of a goth myself, and then he goes into his standard statement, I find beauty in so many different things, that I seek to develop the building in a style suitable to his purpose. So and we have early evidence that he's really interested in picturesque. You look at the watercolors that he does, the European buildings. So he's very interested in that. Again, the language that he uses to describe the skyscrapers, that's Cass Gilbert, and oh my God, what happened to him? But so he does work in all these different styles. And I think he's unusual because he is so comfortable in doing that. Gail, do you want to add something to that?
I was just, as I was listening to you, I did think of something I thought an important point to make for the Woolworth Building because, the Woolworth Building is Gothic. He did intend for it to be a Gothic, although he did draw a classical scheme, but that was mostly because there was some questioning about whether terracotta would be a good material, so he's going to try out stone. But I really do think that his aim was to make this building Gothic. But as all the Gilbert experts know, he's designed a number of closer. I'm sorry. He's designed a number of skyscrapers that are classical skyscrapers in Newark, even close by, for instance. And so, my thinking, Mary Beth brought out a really good point about context. So the associations of these styles that he chooses may relate to the client, may relate to the purpose of the building, and also something very specific about that, that they may also relate to the particular context. And I know he was very interested in the comparison of New York as a center of finance with the Flemish free trading cities. And I think it was also interesting that Joanna brought that out in relation to Chicago. So this was in the air at the time, and Gilbert actually traveled to Flanders, and more broadly, Flanders is situated in the Low Countries, which is a kind of Dutch, it's Dutch and Flemish if you look at it more generally. And so I can see where the context of New York, and New York having this kind of Dutch heritage, and then more generally, and then if you're looking specifically at Flanders and specifically at Bruges, he sketched the buildings of Bruges. He loved these kind of towered secular medieval buildings in Bruges. That New York too is a center of trade. Now, this is not to say that he is not being nostalgic about this, because of course the Middle Ages is a very different trading scenario than what we're seeing in this era of corporate consolidation in Lower Manhattan, the great merger movement. All kinds of muckraking critics are emerging at this time, like Lincoln Steffens, and in a sense, Gilbert's romanticizing of trade can be seen in this kind of context of intensive criticism of the kind of aggressive economic consolidation and the wide earning disparities we're seeing in New York. We're seeing billionaires row on Fifth Avenue and then people in tenements who can hardly get by. So it's a very, very interesting environment in which he's forging his image for business. I'm wondering, yes, we have about 50. Is it okay to take questions from the audience? Yeah.
Quick question in here. Gilbert received a commission to design, I think it was 6 railroad stations on the Mott Haven branch of the New Haven Railroad. There's very little of them left right now. But they each seem to be rather eclectic, and yet within the context of discussing how he tried to adapt the form both to the client and to the circumstance, I'm wondering if any of you knows enough about it to possibly comment about those.
I don't know very much about those. I think 2 of them kind of barely exist now. One is very, very altered, and one is a beautiful terracotta building, but it's in rather condition. My guess, and it is a guess because I haven't really studied that, would be that he was probably looking at the situation, the neighborhood where they were in terms of looking at the style.
The other thing I want to add is I have looked at images of some of them, and I've seen one or two of this type, and some of them it's questionable whether Gilbert actually designed them or not. We don't know yet for sure, but my sense of them, if I think of them all together along this New York-New Haven line, is that they are these arcaded stations. They have these hipped roofs that are tile, usually tile, and so they do have a kind of typological, similarity. I mean, they're alike in some ways. And I can't help but think of Henry Hobson Richardson and his design for the typical small railroad station as being a certain kind of design with the arches and then the hipped roof and with some Oriental influences in them. So I think that, and Gilbert is a huge fan of Henry Hobson Richardson. So I see, his effort to develop this type of the small peripheral railroad station, but with some differences so that this is how Gilbert, now I'm not quoting him or anything, but if I were to kind of try to figure out what he was thinking about these stations, I'd say, well, he'd want each one to be a little bit different so that when people got off at this stop, they would know that they were there. In this part of Connecticut, they would know that that was their station. That's how I think he would think about it. And he would, as Mary Beth was suggesting, perhaps try to connect some of that local architecture. That wouldn't surprise me that he would make references to something local. Okay, we have, this thing doesn't go very far, so Darren.
Before the West Street building, there's not a lot in Gilbert's background to suggest that he would start moving towards the Gothic for office buildings. Was there any fundamental shift in the office? Because a lot of times, depending on who comes into the office, will help dictate a direction that a firm could go. For example, when Stanford White enters Richardson's office, we see obvious shifts in design. Was there anything like that going on? Because, as I said, there wasn't much in his past that showed a Gothic predilection.
Well, he had designed some churches in Minnesota that were Gothic in style. I don't think there was a big shift in the office, to my knowledge. Johnson comes in around 1900, working on the Custom House. I mean, there's some Minnesota people who phase out, but around 1900, he's pretty set with some of his major staff members.
I think your question is very interesting because it's one I've thought a lot about myself. He does, as Joanna noted, have that example of the Bayard building by Louis Sullivan completed in 1899, and he is an admirer of Sullivan. He has high respect for Louis Sullivan. There we see a kind of light-colored terracotta. It's not really Gothic, but you can see the verticality in it. And Mary Beth and I both know we've looked at a range of early drawings for the West Street building, and many of them are, they have a cornice. They're classical, but they've got those Sullivan verticals in them. But his earliest sketches have a very picturesque skyline, and they're always sketches, virtually always, where you have the surroundings of the Hudson River. And you have shipping traffic. And so my sense is that he had decided at a certain point that he wants that verticality, which he thinks is a truthful expression or an appropriate expression for the skyscraper. But he's thinking of picturesque city views. I think from the beginning, he's designing it to be seen from the water, and he wants that top to be picturesque, and he's trying to figure out how to do it. And it's those two things. That's what he's looking for in the West Street. Let's see, I think your hand was up. Okay.
The Wainwright building by Louis Sullivan is very prominent by the massive cornice slab on the roof that terminates the shaft. And I wondered if Cass Gilbert had to contend with the cornice and the feature of the cornice, or did he just get rid of it as the building height increased the way?
The cornice issue is, I think, a very important one. from about 1899. He was an anonymous writer who wrote about the tops of buildings in Architectural Record. And it's a wonderful little article. I think a lot of people probably know it because it's just so fun to look at. He illustrated the tops of and basically argued that the cornice is no way to terminate any building. It just doesn't look, especially from a distance, when you're viewing a building from a distance, the cornice is just not a graceful way to terminate a skyscraper. And so I think very much in the air at that time was this question of whether that's the right, for especially for very tall buildings. Is that the right way for a skyscraper to meet the sky? And Joanna showed the Fraternity Temple project, that's 1890, where we have that kind of pointy top, which I guess is a little bit more interesting, but it's not quite as beautiful as the top of the Woolworth building. And so I think for Gilbert, this was a big, big issue. And I'm not sure if I'm exactly answering your question, but I know for Gilbert, this was a major issue that you really had to watch, how the romance, the aspiration of a tower, and how it ended in the sky. And he went to great deal of effort with the color and choosing just the right color for the roofs and the right color for the accents on the terracotta. He said he wanted to blend with the atmosphere. So he's thinking of how people are seeing this building from the Upper Bay, from the Hudson River, from Broadway, and you just don't chop it off. That's just something you wouldn't do. It wouldn't add beauty to the skyline view. Have I answered your question? Or? Sorry.
So far, nobody's really referred to the LeBron firm, except to say that the offices were in the Metropolitan Water Tower Annex, which is the Hollywood one of its sons. And of course, we talked about the picturesque tower and the way it ends, and I just wondered, is there any reference to...
Absolutely. When I discovered this, I thought it was so interesting. One of the last drawings that Gilbert made prior to the final design, because Woolworth hadn't yet acquired the entire site, was this beautiful Gothic campanile. He thought he was going to make it taller on a smaller site. The proportions follow exactly the proportions of the Metropolitan Tower, but it's been Gothicized. I just find that very, very interesting. And certainly he's right there. He's in the shadow of the Metropolitan Tower. There's one point where he's actually interviewed by a reporter, and he says something like, he just doesn't like the Singer Tower. It's just not going to have any influence French, and people aren't going to really understand this building. It's from Paris, and it's just not going to have any influence over taste. And then he goes, but I think the Metropolitan Life Tower will, even though I see it as a little bit, the design is slightly weak and thin, but it will be more successful than the Singer. And this was from right around 1909, just before he got the commission for the Woolworth building. So Gilbert's judging these other towers quite critically. It's very interesting. And I know. Yes. Hi. Tim, yeah, I know.
You've done a beautiful job at explaining the wide range of choices made possible by early 20th century eclecticism. There was one dimension about all this that I've been wondering about, and a lot of recent scholarship on 19th century and early 20th century architecture points out, which is the role of scientific thinking. And I was wondering if there's any sort of undercurrent about evolution going on here, and it doesn't need to exclude the picturesque, I think. But I think if Sullivan particularly, and I mean, they're thinking that they're moving from Romanesque to Gothic, and that they are evolving.
That is a great question, and I have an answer, but I'm wondering if any of the others want to comment, because I bet all of you have something to say about that.
Thank you for that question. You're absolutely right. I mean, behind all of the philosophy in Chicago is this idea that all races evolve, and that there is a race of Western Americans evolving in Chicago and the Midwest, and that
Hold that as close as possible.
we have to find an architectural style that will represent for the race that is being produced, and that is going to evolve in the same way that people evolve. Absolutely.
And I just want to add, Gilbert was fairly tied into this sort of discussion, maybe not necessarily the discussion in Chicago, but because I don't know how often you read in what architects say, but I know that he was interested in this kind of Darwinian and Spencerian concept of just biological evolution, okay, kind of a simple sense, and that architecture it develops, was the word he used again and again. He doesn't think sudden change is a good thing. All styles in the past developed, one out of the other. You know, the Gothic came out of the Romanesque, and so he could point to this kind of slow development, slow change in history, and he thought that we should be a part of today. We should understand that and be a part of the development of history as things gradually change. So he used that word evolution and those words a lot. Those concepts.
Hi, this is so very interesting, and thank you all for speaking. I'm really stuck on the 88 days. I want to understand. 86.
Don't come to coordinate.
So what was done in 86 days? What are we measuring here? Are we measuring finished?
The working drawings were done.
The working drawings were done in 86 days.
Okay.
All supervision.
Let me be clear so everybody understands this astonishing what happened today. The design developed from April 1910 to January 1911, and it was a design that was actually several designs, because Woolworth wasn't clear about what he wanted to do. He wasn't clear he wanted to build the world's tallest. Carol and I have had discussions about this. He did it clear that he wanted to build the world's tallest building. He couldn't get all the land parcels that he needed the parcels of land he needed to assemble the site. So it was not until early January 1911 that a holdout gave in and they were able to get the big site. So Gilbert really quickly, within a matter of days, produced the design you all see. You know, he had the design, Woolworth approved it, and said, let's move ahead. So this was late January, when everything was, resolved from what we would call a design development standpoint today. That's what architects would call it. The design is all there. So from that late January to mid-April, and that's the 86 days, his office produced all the working drawings they needed for the project in order to they had to file them with the building department before they started construction, theoretically. They'd already started the foundations. I mean, this is it's very interesting to see how these things go in New York at this time. But they produced the working drawings, and Gilbert was really angry with Woolworth, because Woolworth just hired the foundation company as the foundation contractor without even talking to him about it before they'd actually signed a contract with Thompson Starrett. But that's how Woolworth did things.
I'll just add one thing to that, actually. The other thing that was interesting is Woolworth was putting incredible pressure on Gilbert, because the municipal building was starting to go up then too. He's like, I gotta get the tenants. So you've got to crank this out so I can get these leases signed.
So that had any impact on the decision to use terracotta?
For the sake of speed. Yeah, that's an interesting question too. Terracotta, of course, is advantageous from that standpoint. A contemporary wrote about steel, and there's the case is similar. That our buildings today are assembled out of factories, and that's what makes construction go much more rapidly than it did in the past. And I know Joanne has written extensively on the labor issues involved with this. That because we no longer have masons who are carving every detail. We can actually bring these things from the factory to the site. This did create some labor issues.
Can I just add? Most people. Yeah, that's sorry. You can't put that too close to jump. So actually, if you stand up and talk, also it keeps the separation of the feedback loop. In terms of the timing, one thing that most people don't realize anymore, because it's not a convention that we follow today, was that there was a moving day in New York, and if the building was not finished by May 1st of that year, you would lose the tenant's lease. So everything is measured against a schedule of finishing by that 1 month of the year, or losing the opportunity for maybe a year's worth of lease, because everybody's moving at that time. So against that kind of annual schedule is the point from which they need to measure back in how long they anticipated their work schedule would take to complete.
A question went back there.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. This is, after all, the Woolworth Building, and that means it represents, at least in some regards, the corporate badge for a company. Is this a building that Gilbert wanted to design and he didn't really care the company that it represented, or is there something of the Woolworth company ethic that is built into this building in any place?
That's interesting too, because it's a very interesting question, because it points to the relationship between Gilbert and Woolworth. I know that Gilbert, and I discussed this with Carol about the highest in the world, that Gilbert was eager to design the highest skyscraper in the world. He had, and it's actually on exhibit at the Skyscraper Museum, and sketched this lovely Gothic building of 150 stories high in 1905, and it's towering over all the skyscrapers of Lower Manhattan, and people in hot air balloons are flying by. He's just very eager to build the world's tallest. And so when Woolworth comes along, Woolworth wanted a 20-story skyscraper, but I think Gilbert knows that this is a guy who could build the world's tallest skyscraper. So he decides he really wants to work with Woolworth. Now, what I think that Gilbert really did know is precisely the thing you're pointing to, that Woolworth was really going to exploit this project to the hilt. Once he decided he was going to do it, he was going to publicize it, as the tallest building in the world and get that news out all around the world. He eventually used it as a trademark on his commodities. He imprinted his commodities with the Woolworth Building as a trademark. And so it became very much part of the iconography of Woolworth's company and the branding strategy that Woolworth used in the corporate literature into the 20th century. You see it again and again. It's everywhere. And I don't know that Gilbert ever really thought about that. And the other thing I think is interesting in this regard is that it was 1916, Gilbert commissioned a book of photographs of just the Woolworth Building by a pictorialist photographer named Wallace Gillies. And the building is really treated as a pictorialist photographer would treat it. There's nothing garish, nothing commercial. He bounds these photographs in a leather volume. That's how he wanted to see it, as a work of fine art. So I think they were somewhat at odds with each other.
And just to be clear on my form follows finance emphasis, this building may have been a symbol of the Woolworth Corporation, but it was not, and it had the executive offices of the Woolworth Company, but it was designed as a speculative office building, right? There were more than 1,000 different tenants, and only 1.5 floors were occupied by the Woolworth Company. So this is not the hive of a corporation where everybody goes to work like in the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company and works in the clerks or some division or the whatever department within the company. This was designed from the get-go as a speculative office building in order to attract, through its high quality, the best, most high-paying tenants.
And Woolworth.
Is there a Woolworth store?
No.
No, you don't want a Woolworth store. And just to really clarify Carol's point, Woolworth was investing in it as a speculative office building. I mean, I think that's really key. And he saw this as a way to create the trademark. This was the vehicle by which he could create the trademark.
You can buy the prospectus that was published for this right now at the Complete Traveler at 35th and Madison, if you're curious.
No, I know about this, the prospectus, that it actually explains it as a rental property, and that's a valuable thing, so it's for sale.
Yes.
I just came to the Skyscraper Museum. One thing I missed from the see, who owned the land before Woolworth bought it, and how much did you pay for it?
Okay, altogether he paid $4.5 million. And there was a dry goods store here and a few other low buildings. There was a store that sold accoutrements for Catholic religious services. It was that kind of thing, small-scale commercial.
So outside is terracotta and this is marble that we're looking at?
Now we're looking at marble on the interior. You're surrounded by it from the Greek island of Skyros.
And what about terracotta, the outside?
Yes. I think we're just about out of time. I know that Mary Woods had a question. Can we
Well, I don't know if I can ask it or not, but Gail, I was very taken by your point, his attempts early on to see the Woolworth Building within an urban context. I mean, it wasn't just an isolated object, it was to be prominent. And so maybe this is a question for Dietrich. Who was it that made the decision to light the Woolworth Building at night, so it would be a 24/7 proposition on the skyline? And again, I think it goes back to the question of the kind of fusion of art and technology. at that time. So did it come from Woolworth or Gilbert? Or?
Did you?
To be quite honest, I don't know the answer. But I think lighting has been in the air for temporary celebrations, Hudson celebration, for instance, and a few others. And I think it was much discussed, fairs that tried it out. And I think somehow it was very much in the end, the technology was finally not quite there. My one is, to be honest, for the photographs that we see with the Woolworth Building were usually a one-night affair. The building was lit up and then they photographed it and then they had to switch the lights off because it was just too much load on the paper provided. So photographs give us the image that it was always lit, but in the beginning it was very spotty, only on special occasions and photographs as well. But
So
who initiated it?
It was early installation art then.
Yes.
Actually, Mary, I do know that Woolworth, this was really important for Woolworth. He inaugurated, it was his decision. Dietrich's context is extremely important, but Woolworth wanted this. He inaugurated it on January 1915, and he just oversaw the installation of, I think it was 24 automobile headlights of the largest size at various places on the tower, so that the light would project downward, it would project upward. Now, Gilbert's lighting engineer was overseeing all this, but Woolworth really was the person. And he wrote to his store managers that now it's a splendid advertisement at night. My tower reaches a larger advertising audience, even bigger than the newspapers can reach, because I've got the lights on the tower at night. So his aim was to advertise.
I think actually, Gail, the flood wash of the lighting, which is not the original lighting of 1913 when they illuminated from the inside all of the empty building all at once on opening day. It was in 1915 that they actually added the
So it's January,
the facade.
the new year 1915.
It wasn't.
Now, especially, I was thinking of the one where it was lit from the inside, which is on your on the cover of your.
I thought she meant the flood lighting.
That was the one night.
You did. Okay, there are two lighting schemes: the opening lighting scheme from the inside, and the flood lighting starting New Year 1915.
As disorder begins to break out a little bit. We have some coffee and cookies for a break. We have our speakers, who I'm sure will be happy to answer individual questions, and then we'll be up to the second round. Dietrich Neumann and Mary Woods will be talking, and also Suzanne Stevens, about this broader picture of the cultural impact both in New York and in the architectural world and in the world overall. So that's